The following is a passage from the book The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda, where Don Juan enlists the help of an acquaintance to introduce Carlos to Peyote, or as he referred to it, Mezcalito. Don Juan urged me softly, "Chew it, chew it." My hands were wet and my stomach contracted. The jar with peyote buttons was on the floor by the chair. I bent over, took one at random, and put it in my mouth. It had a stale taste. I bit it in two and started to chew on one of the pieces. I felt a strong, pungent bitterness. In a moment, my whole mouth was numb. The bitterness increased as I kept on chewing, forcing an incredible flow of saliva. My gums and the inside of my mouth felt as if I had eaten salty, dry meat or fish, which seemed to force one to chew more. After a while, I chewed the other piece, and my mouth was so numb I couldn't feel the bitterness any more. The peyote button was a bunch of shreds, like the fibrous part of an orange or like sugar cane, and I didn't know whether to swallow it or spit it out. At that moment, the owner of the house got up and invited everybody to go out to the porch. We went out and sat in the darkness. It was quite comfortable outside, and the host brought out a bottle of tequila. The men were seated in a row with their backs to the wall. I was at the extreme right of the line. Don Juan, who was next to me, placed the jar with the peyote buttons between my legs. Then he handed me the bottle, which was passed down the line, and told me to take some of the tequila to wash away the bitterness. I spit out the shreds of the first button and took a sip. He told me not to swallow it, but to just rinse out my mouth with it to stop the saliva. It did not help much with the saliva, but it certainly helped to wash away some of the bitterness. Don Juan gave me a piece of dried apricot, or perhaps it was a dried fig. I couldn't see in the dark, nor could I taste it, and told me to chew it thoroughly and slowly without rushing. I had difficulty swallowing it. It felt as if it would not go down. After a short pause, the bottle went around again. Don Juan handed me a piece of crispy dried meat. I told him I did not feel like eating. "This is not eating," he said firmly. The pattern was repeated 6 times. I remember having chewed 6 peyote buttons when the conversation became very lively. Although I could not distinguish what language was spoken, the topic of conversation, in which everybody participated, was very interesting, and I attempted to listen carefully, so that I could take part. But when I tried to speak, I realized I couldn't. The words shifted aimlessly about in my mind. I sat with my back propped against the wall and listened to what the men were saying. They were talking in Italian, and repeated over and over one phrase about the stupidity of sharks. I thought it was a logical, coherent topic. I had told Don Juan earlier that the Colorado River in Arizona was called by the early Spaniards El Rio de los Tizones, the river of charred wood, and someone misspelled or misread tizones, and the river was called El Rio de los Tiburones, the river of the sharks. I was sure they were discussing that story, yet it never occurred to me to think that none of them could speak Italian. I had a very strong desire to throw up, but I don't recall the actual act. I asked if somebody would get me some water. I was experiencing an unbearable thirst. Don Juan brought me a large saucepan. He placed it on the ground next to the wall. He also brought a little cup or can. He dipped it into the pan and handed it to me, and said I could not drink, but should just freshen my mouth with it. The water looked strangely shiny, glossy, like a thick varnish. I wanted to ask Don Juan about it, and laboriously I tried to voice my thoughts in English. But then I realized he did not speak English. I experienced a very confusing moment and became aware of the fact that, although there was a clear thought in my mind, I could not speak. I wanted to comment on the strange quality of the water, but what followed next was not speech. It was the feeling of my unvoiced thoughts coming out of my mouth in a sort of liquid form. It was an effortless sensation of vomiting without the contractions of the diaphragm. It was a pleasant flow of liquid words. I drank, and the feeling that I was vomiting disappeared. By that time, all noises had vanished, and I found I had difficulty focusing my eyes. I looked for Don Juan, and as I turned my head, I noticed that my field of vision had diminished to a circular area in front of my eyes. This feeling was neither frightening nor discomforting, but quite on the contrary, it was a novelty. I could literally sweep the ground by focusing on one spot, and then moving my head slowly in any direction. When I had first come out to the porch, I had noticed it was all dark except for the distant glare of the city lights. Yet within the circular area of my vision, everything was clear. I forgot about my concern with Don Juan and the other men, and gave myself entirely to exploring the ground with my pinpoint vision. I saw the juncture of the porch floor and the wall. I turned my head slowly to the right, following the wall, and saw Don Juan sitting against it. I shifted my head to the left in order to focus on the water. I found the bottom of the pan. I raised my head slightly and saw a medium-sized black dog approaching. I saw him coming toward the water. The dog began to drink. I raised my hand to push him away from my water. I focused my pinpoint vision on the dog to carry on the movement, and suddenly I saw him become transparent. The water was a shiny, viscous liquid. I saw it going down the dog's throat into his body. I saw it flowing evenly through his entire length, and then shooting out through each one of the hairs. I saw the iridescent fluid traveling along the length of each individual hair, and then projecting out of the hairs to form a long, white, silky mane. At that moment, I had the sensation of intense convulsions, and in a matter of instants, a tunnel formed around me. Very low and narrow, hard and strangely cold. It felt to the touch like a wall of solid tinfoil. I found I was sitting on the tunnel floor. I tried to stand up, but hit my head on the metal roof, and the tunnel compressed itself until it was suffocating me. I remember having to crawl toward a sort of round point where the tunnel ended. When I finally arrived, if I did, I had forgotten all about the dog, Don Juan, and myself. I was exhausted. My clothes were soaked in a cold, sticky liquid. I rolled back and forth, trying to find a position in which to rest, a position where my heart would not pound so hard. In one of those shifts, I saw the dog again. Every memory came back to me at once, and suddenly all was clear in my mind. I turned around to look for Don Juan, but I could not distinguish anything or anyone. All I was capable of seeing was the dog becoming iridescent. An intense light radiated from his body. I saw again the water flowing through him, kindling him like a bonfire. I got to the water, sank my face in the pan, and drank with him. My hands were in front of me on the ground, and as I drank, I saw the fluid running through my veins, setting up hues of red and yellow and green. I drank more and more. I drank until I was all afire. I was all aglow. I drank until the fluid went out of my body through each pore and projected out like fibers of silk. I too acquired a long, lustrous, iridescent mane. I looked at the dog, and his mane was like mine. A supreme happiness filled my whole body, and we ran together toward a sort of yellow warmth that came from some indefinite place. And there we played. We played and wrestled until I knew his wishes and he knew mine. We took turns manipulating each other, in the fashion of a puppet show. I could make him move his legs by twisting my toes, and every time he nodded his head, I felt an irresistible impulse to jump. But his most impish act was to make me scratch my head with my foot while I sat. He did it by flapping his ears from side to side. The action to me was utterly unbearably funny. Such a touch of grace and irony, such mastery, I thought. The euphoria that possessed me was indescribable. I laughed until it was almost impossible to breathe. I had the clear sensation of not being able to open my eyes. I was looking through a tank of water. It was a long and very painful state, filled with the anxiety of not being able to wake up and yet being awake. Then, slowly, the world became clear and in focus. My field of vision became very round and ample, and with it came an ordinary conscious act, which was to turn around and look for that marvelous being. At this point, I encountered the most difficult transition. The passage from my normal state had taken place almost without my realizing it. I was aware. My thoughts and feelings were a corollary of that awareness, and the passing was smooth and clear. But this second change, the awakening to serious, sober consciousness, was genuinely shocking. I had forgotten that I was a man. The sadness of such an irreconcilable situation was so intense that I wept. Sunday, August 6th, 1961. I drove Don Juan to the house where I had taken Peyote. On the way, he told me the name of the man who had offered me to Mescalito was John. When we got to the house, we found John sitting on his porch with two young men. All of them were extremely jovial. They laughed and talked with great ease. The three of them spoke English perfectly. I told John that I had come to thank him for having helped me. I wanted to get their views on my behavior during the hallucinogenic experience, and told them that I had been trying to think of what I had done that night, and that I could not remember. They laughed and were reluctant to talk about it. They seemed to be holding back on account of Don Juan. They all glanced at him as though waiting for an affirmative cue to go on. Don Juan must have cued them, although I did not notice anything, because suddenly John began to tell me what I had done that night. He said he knew I had been taken when he heard me puking. He estimated that I must have puked 30 times. Don Juan corrected him and said it was only 10 times. John continued. Then we all moved next to you. You were stiff, and you were having convulsions for a very long time while lying on your back. You moved your mouth as though talking. Then you began to bump your head on the floor, and Don Juan put an old hat on your head and you stopped it. You shivered and whined for hours, lying on the floor. I think everybody fell asleep then, but I heard you puffing and groaning in my sleep. Then I heard you scream and I woke up. I saw you leaping up in the air, screaming. You made a dash for the water, knocked the pan over, and began to swim in the puddle. Don Juan brought you more water. You sat quietly in front of the pan. Then you jumped up and took off all your clothes. You were kneeling in front of the water, drinking in big gulps. Then you just sat there and stared into space. We thought you were going to be there forever. Nearly everybody was asleep, including Don Juan, when suddenly you jumped up again, howling, and took off after the dog. The dog got scared and howled too, and ran to the back of the house. Then everybody woke up. We all got up. You came back from the other side, still chasing the dog. The dog was running ahead of you, barking and howling. I think you must have gone 20 times around the house, running in circles, barking like a dog. I was afraid people were going to be curious. There are no neighbors close, but your howling was so loud, it could have been heard for miles. One of the young men added, You caught up with the dog and brought it to the porch in your arms. John continued, Then you began to play with the dog. You wrestled with him, and the dog and you bit each other and played. That I thought was funny. My dog does not play usually. But this time, you and the dog were rolling on each other. Then you ran to the water and the dog drank with you, the young man said. You ran 5 or 6 times to the water with the dog. How long did this go on? I asked. Hours, John said. At one time we lost sight of you two. I think you must have run to the back. We just heard you barking and groaning. You sounded so much like a dog that we couldn't tell you two apart. Maybe it was just the dog alone, I said. They laughed, and John said, You were barking there, boy. What happened next? The three men looked at one another and seemed to have a hard time deciding what happened next. Finally, the young man who had not said anything spoke up. "He choked," he said, looking at John. "Yes, you certainly choked. You began to cry very strangely, and then you fell to the floor. We thought you were biting your tongue. Don Juan opened your jaws and poured water on your face. Then you started shivering and having convulsions all over again. Then you stayed motionless for a long time. Don Juan said it was all over. By then it was morning, so we covered you with a blanket and left you to sleep on the porch." He stopped there and looked at the other men who were obviously trying not to laugh. He turned to Don Juan and asked him something. Don Juan smiled and answered his question. John turned to me and said, "We left you here on the porch because we were afraid you were going to piss all over the rooms." They all laughed very loudly. "What was the matter with me?" I asked. "Did you?" John sort of mimicked me. "We were not going to mention it, but Don Juan says it is all right. You pissed all over my dog." "What did I do?" "You don't think the dog was running because he was afraid of you, do you? The dog was running because you were pissing on him." There was general laughter at this point. I tried to question one of the young men, but they were all laughing and didn't hear me. John went on. "My dog got even, though. He pissed on you, too." This statement was apparently utterly funny, because they all roared with laughter, including Don Juan. When they had quieted down, I asked in all earnestness, "Is this really true? This really happened?" Still laughing, John replied, "I swear, my dog really pissed on you." Driving back to Don Juan's place, I asked him, "Did all that really happen, Don Juan?" "Yes," he said, "but they don't know what you saw. They don't realize you were playing with him. That is why I did not disturb you." "But is this business of the dog and me pissing on each other true?" "It was not a dog. How many times do I have to tell you that? This is the only way to understand it. It's the only way. It was he who played with you." "Did you know all this was happening before I told you about it?" He vacillated for an instant before answering. "No. I remembered, after you told me about it, the strange way you looked. I just suspected you were doing fine because you didn't seem scared." "Did the dog really play with me, as they say?" "God damn it, it was not a dog." End of passage. To learn more about the teachings of Don Juan, check out the book, The Teachings of Don Juan, by Carlos Castaneda, wherever fine books are sold. I thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.